Welcome to the Virtual Foundry podcast.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Virtual Foundry podcast. This is volume 3, episode 12. Today is Friday, September 9th, 2022. The time is 11:09 a.m. and the temperature is a nice 77 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 25 degrees for you Celsius users. We are barreling into fall with high temperature in a couple of days of just 60 degrees. That's 15 degrees Fahrenheit. But American football starts this weekend, and that just brings thoughts of cooler weather. So it's very good timing for all of this stuff to come together. I'm Trisha Cease, president of the Virtual Foundry, and with me, as always, is Brad Woods, founder, inventor, and all-around science guy. Say hello, Brad.
Everybody.
So, Brad, today we're going to be talking about how FFF metal is very similar to precious metal clay. Now, I know a lot about metal 3D printing, and I know nothing about precious metal clay. So let's go back to the beginning. What is it?
Okay, this is a pretty interesting story. So precious metal clays were actually they were developed by a metallurgist at Mitsubishi named Masaki Morikawa. So this dude, I think he just did it as a side project, and it kind of turned into something that became more and more interesting with time. And eventually, Mitsubishi patented it, and I believe they're still producing most of the materials that they started with. So what it is it's sort of a friendly version of metal injection molding. So metal injection molding was developed in the 70s. And like all of the things that we talk about, these are various techniques for applying powder metallurgy. And in this example, at the time, the metal injection molding stuff, the binders were complex, really only appropriate for industrial applications. This person had a vision, and he started with silver and gold for a particular reason. I'll circle back to that in a moment. But he started with silver and gold, and he simply mixed it together with rice flour.
Mm.
So he took silver powder that he scavenged from the photographic industry, blended it with rice flour, and added a little bit of water, and wound up with a malleable clay that can be formed by hand with relative ease. And this follows exactly the same process as metal injection molding, bound metal 3D printing, FFF metal 3D printing, and and other techniques that use a binder. So you create the part, you create the shape. The second step is to debind it. So you add heat until the binder vaporizes or burns off. You continue to raise the heat until the particles weld to one another. You then have a pure metal part. So Mitsubishi's, they started with the noble metals. So the first two they did were gold and silver. Silver and gold have an interesting property where they don't take up oxygen readily. You can heat them, and you can heat them in open air, and no matter what you do, there is no oxide of gold. You know, it just doesn't. There may be some situations where it happens in nature, but it's not common. That's why silver and gold are two elements that tend to appear in nature in their pure state, not as an oxide. So that made them very suitable for this process because you could simply heat it with a torch. So in his original versions, he would just take the clay and literally hit it with a blowtorch, and he had a metal part. It's really cool. And some of it still works that way. Some precious metal clays can be torch fired. Some people do that. It's more difficult to control, but you get the instant gratification thing, and it's pretty interesting. So where this ties to metal printing is that nearly all current methods of 3D printing metal involve some form or some adaptation of powder metallurgy. They either start with a powder bed and then melt it with a laser, or they start with a powder bed and they glue the parts together and then later debind that glue and sinter it. Or in the case of the Virtual Foundry materials, an FFF metal, we mix it with a thermopolymer and make it into a filament. And this filament is compatible with any of the typical FFF 3D printers on the market today. All of these additive manufacturing methods are forms of powder metallurgy. And this continues to be true and likely won't change at anytime soon. There are a couple variations where they're melting wire, sort of like MIG welding or metal inert gas welding, where they're melting a wire down, but you can't be very precise. So all you can do is lay down a rough shape and then come back and machine it into the final shape. So it's very difficult to get a net shape part using other additive manufacturing methods for metal.
Now, who is using precious metal clay, and what equipment do they need to work with it?
Right. So the standard setup, most of the users right now, and I think most people would be surprised how many users there are. So there are like international associations of users, and they all tend to be jewelers and craftspeople. We've had one exception to that, and this was kind of interesting. So we had somebody contact the Virtual Foundry that realized that they could 3D print parts that they were currently making with precious metal clay, but they were scientists. And as the woman explained, that the scientists were having a hard time with the art factor of precious metal clays and thought that being able to print it would be revolutionary for them, which I thought was pretty interesting. But yeah, it's used internationally. And like I said, mostly jewelers and people like that. I have some. And we'll post some links in the description for the video for more information. There's an excellent Wikipedia article that runs through the whole history of all of this stuff in great detail, including the firing schedules that the original inventor published at the time that he did it. But I'll show this in my video. But this is the stuff. It looks like clay. If you're a sculptor, the stuff is challenging to work with. It tends to be more sticky and dry and want to pull apart. But with some practice, people make some truly stunning jewelry pieces and things like that.
You talked about torch firing earlier. Can you do that debind and sinter process in a common kiln like you can with the Virtual Foundry filaments?
Yeah. In fact, there's a lot of crossover. So many we sell Paragon kilns and we sell even heat kilns. Those are the two main choices of the precious metal clay community. The Paragon tends to have a lot of crossover with glasswork, beadwork, lampwork, they call it, all kinds of different things that require heat. But the kilns themselves, there's a 1 in 3 chance people are either buying those kilns from Paragon to fire ceramics, glass, or precious metal clays.
Okay, so it sounds like there's a lot of crossover and similarity. So if someone who knows about precious metal clay, they're already going to understand that debind and sinter process. What would they need to do in order to make the leap into FFF metal and the Virtual Foundry printing with the Virtual Foundry filaments?
So all they need is an FFF 3D printer. So a 3D printer that uses filament. And what's happened over time is a lot of jewelers are using, I can't think of the word they use, like lost resin, I think you would call it. So they're working with the optical resins and then printing complex objects that way. Then they invest it in casting plaster, burn it out, and then pour molten metal back in. So like a very traditional jewelry making technique. But the type of printer you're going to want, if you have a printer that will print filament, you have what you need. Let me say that again. If you have a printer that will print filament and you have a kiln and you're making precious metal clays, you have everything that you need.
Yeah.
There isn't a lot of crossover, there isn't a lot of difference. They're nearly the same thing. As time has passed, 3D printing has become easier. More people are doing it, and many jewelers and artists have this type of printer and have everything that they need to go forward.
Now, what are the most common materials in use out there with metal clays?
Right. Okay, so this was part of my talk about my point about precious noble metals. So the easiest ones to work with are silver and gold, which are obviously the most expensive. So the next phase of precious metal clays was developing simple techniques for sintering base metals. And the two most common there are copper and bronze.
Mm.
So I would say a huge portion of precious metal clay at this point, a lot of it is silver, but obviously, which is much more expensive. But the copper and bronze, the stuff's everywhere and easy to work with. And the solution that we use for managing oxidation during the sintering cycle is the same as the solution that was developed for sintering base metal precious clays.
And the base metals that you mentioned are copper and bronze, and we know that sintering temperatures for those two materials are really accessible in low-cost tabletop style kilns.
Yes.
It sounds like silver and gold are a little easier to work with because of the factor that they aren't prone to oxidization.
Yeah, close enough.
Would it be great if we had a silver 3D printing filament?
Oh, wouldn't it be? It's funny you should mention that. I have a few kilos of silver powder sitting on my workbench right now. So this is going to be one of our next materials to be released is a sinterable pure silver 3D printing filament.
Yes, we're all very excited about that one.
Yes.
Now, when would someone choose to work with precious metal clay versus FFF metal or vice versa?
Well, there are very few industrial applications for the clay materials. All of them require some type of hand manipulation or some type of artistic skill, at least at some fundamental level. The advantage of the 3D printer is that it's fully mechanized and automated and all that good stuff. And you can create incredibly complex shapes using CAD software. So in a way, you could say that our filament takes the advantages of precious metal clay and combines it with the high-tech accuracy of 3D printing.
Great. Now, Brad, I do have one more very important question for you before we wrap up our conversation today.
All right.
Why do seagulls fly over the ocean?
I have no idea.
Because if they flew over the bay, we would have to call them bagels.
Nice.
So, hey, listen, if you've got a topic you'd like us to do a deep dive on, we would be happy to do a podcast with or for you. Reach out to info@thevirtualfoundry.com. If you've got a cool project you'd like to show off in this format, we'd love to interview you. So that's info@thevirtualfoundry.com. Be sure to like and subscribe and share with your friends. Until next time, happy printing, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Is your hair good?
The blooper, hang on.
Prone to oxidization.